In 1857, banks across America began collapsing in a single autumn, and on the frontier, almost nobody noticed. Families 1,000 miles from the nearest bank kept living exactly as they had the week before. They had never put a dollar inside one, and they never planned to. The economy that fed them, clothed them, and built their homes ran on something else entirely, something so ordinary that nobody bothered writing it down, and something so effective that within 100 years, an entire industry would spend fortunes making sure you forgot it ever existed. Here's the twist. No 15 on this list was so successful at moving money outside the banking system that the United States Congress passed a law specifically to kill it, not because it was unsafe, but because it worked too well. Number 17 started as a simple solution to a real problem on the frontier, and ended as one of the most notorious traps ever set for an American worker, the kind of trap men sang songs about 100 years later. And no one isn't a method, a trick, or a tool at all. It's a single idea, and it's the one idea every bank built after 1863 has spent more than a century trying to make you forget. These were not poverty habits. They were a complete financial system, built by people who had every reason not to trust banks, and who built something better instead. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what frontier families knew about money might be more relevant today than it has been in 100 years. Let's count down the 20 frontier money secrets the banking system erased from American memory. 20. The pelt was the dollar. Long before the first national currency existed, frontier trading posts ran on a simple principle. Whatever a man could carry, hunt, or trim from an animal's back had a fixed value, agreed on by everyone within 100 miles. A prime beaver pelt was worth a set amount of lead, powder, cloth, or flour, and a trapper could walk in with nothing but furs and walk out with everything he needed for the next year. Deerskins were so common as units of value across the southern frontier that men started calling a dollar a buck, a word that survives in everyday English 2 centuries later, long after anyone remembers why. There was no exchange rate to check, no bank to visit, and no paper to sign. The value was carried on the animal's back, and everyone agreed on the number before the trade even started. When paper currency finally reached these regions, it arrived as a foreign idea, something printed by a bank 1,000 miles away that might or might not be honored at the next post down the river. A pelt, on the other hand, was honored everywhere, by everyone, every time. Modern researchers studying informal trade networks have found that systems like this often moved goods more efficiently than early paper currency, because the value was self-evident and impossible to counterfeit. A man's wealth on the frontier wasn't a number in a ledger somewhere else. It was strapped to his pack horse, and nobody could freeze it, devalue it, or take a cut on the way through. 19. Paying debts in whiskey. On the frontier, corn was everywhere and cash was nowhere, and that single fact created one of the strangest currencies in American history. A bushel of corn was heavy, bulky, and worth almost nothing by the time a farmer hauled it over mountain trails to a market town. The same bushel, distilled into whiskey, shrank down to a few gallons and became worth far more than the grain that made it. Farmers across Appalachia and the Ohio Valley began paying debts, settling rents, and trading for tools and jugs of whiskey, because everyone agreed on what a gallon was worth, and a gallon never spoiled on the trip to market. When the federal government tried to tax whiskey in 1794, it wasn't just taxing a drink. It was taxing the only currency thousands of frontier families had, and the result was an armed uprising that took federal troops to put down. That single fact tells you everything about how real this currency was. Today the idea sounds almost like a joke, a frontier legend exaggerated for effect. But court records, store ledgers, and tax disputes from the period confirm it again and again. A jug of whiskey paid the blacksmith. A jug of whiskey paid the preacher. A jug of whiskey settled a dispute over a fence line. The value wasn't in the alcohol. The value was in the fact that it was portable, durable, and universally wanted, 3 things the federal currency of the time often was not. 18. A pinch of gold dust. When gold turned up in California in 1848, paper money and coins were almost non-existent in the mining camps, and an entirely new kind of currency took over within months. Every general store, saloon, and boarding house kept a small brass scale on the counter, and prices weren't quoted in dollars. They were quoted in pinches, in grains, in fractions of an ounce. A man paid for his dinner by pouring a stream of gold dust from a leather pouch onto the scale until the storekeeper said stop. The system ran almost entirely on trust, because dust could be shaved, scales could be tilted, and a thumb pressed just slightly on the pan could quietly add a few extra grains to every single transaction all day long. Miners knew this, storekeepers knew this, and everyone simply factored it into the cost of doing business in a place with no banks for hundreds of miles. A rough standard set gold at around $16 an ounce, but in practice, the real value of an ounce depended entirely on who was holding the scale. Within a few years, private mints and assay offices sprang up specifically to convert this chaotic dust economy into coins people could trust further from the source. But for those first frantic years, an entire regional economy ran on weight, trust, and the steady hand of a man with a scale, a system invented on the spot because there was nothing else to use. 17. Company store Scrip. This is where the story turns, because this entry didn't start as something banks erased. It started as something a company invented, and it became one of the most effective traps in American economic history. Remote mining and logging camps, paying workers in cash made little sense when the nearest bank, or even the nearest town, was a full day's ride away. So companies issued their own currency instead, paper or metal tokens called Scrip, redeemable only at the company-owned store. On paper, it solved a real logistics problem. In practice, it locked an entire workforce inside a closed economy where the company set every price, controlled every wage, and collected the money right back the moment it was spent. A miner could work an entire month, get paid in Scrip worth less outside the gates than it was worth inside, and end the month owing the company more than he earned. The phrase still echoes in American folk music a century later, the line about owing your soul to the company store. In the 1960s and 70s, federal labor law had largely outlawed paying wages in anything except legal currency, specifically because of how thoroughly this system had been abused. The lesson here isn't that frontier families invented something brilliant. The opposite. This is the one entry on this list that shows exactly what happens when a community loses control of its own currency to a single, powerful outside institution. Every other trick on this list is the cure. One was the disease. 16. The general store tab. Cash on the frontier was scarce, but trust was not, and the general store ledger was where that trust became an entire credit system. Every family in a rural community had a running account, written by hand in a leather-bound book behind the counter. Flour, nails, fabric, and coffee all went on the tab, and the family paid it down when the crops came in, when the hogs were sold, or when the cream check arrived from the creamery. There was no interest charged, no minimum payment, and no credit application. The storekeeper extended credit based on something far more reliable than a number on a form. He knew the family. He knew their land, their work ethic, and their word. A man's credit was his reputation, full stop, and a family that paid its tab every fall could borrow against next year's harvest with nothing but a conversation. This system held entire rural economies together for generations, long before any bank branch existed within 100 miles. It also meant a bad harvest didn't mean a missed payment notice and a fee. It meant a longer ledger entry and an understanding nod, because the storekeeper had been through bad years himself, and he knew the difference between someone who couldn't pay and someone who wouldn't. That distinction has almost completely disappeared from how credit works today, and most people don't even know it used to exist. 15. Private bank notes. For most of the early 1800s, the United States had no single national currency at all. Instead, thousands of individual banks, many of them tiny operations on the edge of the frontier, printed their own paper money, backed by whatever gold or silver they claimed to be holding in a back room. Some of these notes were rock solid. Others were printed by banks that existed mostly on paper themselves, located in towns so remote that nobody could realistically travel out to check whether the gold was actually there. People called the worst of these wildcat banks, because the joke was that the bank existed only where wildcats outnumbered people, far from anyone who might ask questions. A note from a trusted bank might trade at full value 2 counties over. A note from a wildcat bank might be worth 70 cents on the dollar the moment you cross the river, if anyone would take it at all. For decades, this chaotic system actually worked, in the sense that it kept money moving through regions the federal government had almost no presence in at all. Then, in 1863 and 1865, the federal government passed laws that effectively taxed these private currencies out of existence, clearing the way for a single national banking system. It wasn't framed as shutting down competition. It was framed as creating order, but the result was the same. Thousands of small, local currencies, controlled by people the community actually knew, were replaced by one system, controlled from far away, and the law made sure there was no going back. 14. Buried coin caches. Long before anyone had heard the phrase bank run, frontier families already understood something the rest of the country would learn the hard way, again and again, in 1837, in 1857, and in 1873. Banks failed. When they failed, the money inside them simply vanished, and there was no government program waiting to make anyone whole. So families kept their real wealth where no bank could touch it. Gold and silver coins went into tin boxes, glass jars, and iron strongboxes, buried under barn floors, root cellars, or marked corners of a field that only the head of the household could find again. This wasn't paranoia. It was a direct response to watching neighbors lose everything overnight when a bank's doors simply didn't open one morning. A buried cash couldn't earn interest, but it also couldn't be wiped out by a panic 2 states away, couldn't be loaned out against the family's wishes, and couldn't disappear because of a decision made in a city the family had never visited. To this day, collectors and metal detector enthusiasts occasionally turn up small caches of period coins on old farmland, tiny time capsules left by families who trusted dirt more than they trusted paper, and who, given the history of frontier banking, were not entirely wrong to. 13. Land as the only bank. On the frontier, a man's net worth wasn't a number in an account. It was the boundary line around his property. Land didn't pay interest, but it didn't need to, because land did something cash never could. It fed a family, year after year, with no withdrawal limit and no risk of collapse. A farm that produced food, fuel, and building material was worth more to the family living on it than the same value sitting in a vault somewhere, earning a fraction of a percent while the family went hungry. This is part of why so many frontier families were what later generations would call cash poor and land rich, a phrase that confused city bankers for decades. To a banker, a family with no cash and 300 acres looked broke. To the family, 300 acres was the most secure asset in the entire country, immune to currency collapse, immune to bank failure, and guaranteed to still be there next spring no matter what happened to any financial institution anywhere. Land could be passed down, divided among children, or sold outright when cash was genuinely needed, but it was never the first thing a family reached for in hard times. It was the last thing, because everyone understood that once the land was gone, there was no getting it back, and no bank account ever built could replace it. 12. 160 acres for free. In 1862, the federal government made an offer that sounds almost unbelievable today. Head west, build a home, work the land for 5 years, and the government would hand over 160 acres, free and clear, no purchase price, no mortgage, and no bank involved at all. Only currency required was labor, time, and the willingness to survive. Over the following decades, more than 250 million acres passed into private hands this way, an area larger than several European countries combined, and almost none of it required a single dollar to change hands. A family that proved up their claim walked away owning real property worth thousands of dollars, built entirely from sweat equity, a phrase that didn't exist yet but described exactly what was happening. There was no down payment, no credit check, and no interest accruing in the background. Risk was real. Many claims failed, and the land itself could be brutal. But for the families who succeeded, this was wealth creation on a scale that modern home buyers can barely imagine, an asset worth a small fortune, earned entirely through labor rather than financing. It's one of the largest wealth transfers in American history, and almost nobody frames it that way anymore, because it doesn't fit neatly into how we're taught to think about how people get rich. 11. Livestock as walking capital. A frontier family's most valuable possession often had 4 legs and could feed itself along the way. Cattle, in particular, functioned as a moving, breeding, appreciating asset that required no vault and no paperwork. After the Civil War, cattle that were worth around $4 a head in Texas could be driven north along established trails and sold for 10 times that amount at railheads in Kansas, an enormous return on an asset that mostly managed itself by grazing along the route. Even on a smaller scale, a single cow represented something close to a small business. She produced milk daily, calves yearly, and could be sold whole if the family hit a crisis that required real cash fast. Unlike a bank account, livestock grew on its own, required no fees, and could be converted to other forms of wealth almost anywhere, because every town in cattle country had someone willing to buy or trade for a healthy animal. The risk, of course, was real too. Disease, weather, and theft could wipe out a herd the way a bank failure could wipe out an account. But the difference was control. A family could see their wealth, feed their wealth, and protect their wealth with their own hands every single day, instead of trusting it to a building they might never set foot inside. 10. The original savings account. Every fall, before anything else happened with the harvest, a frontier farmer set aside the best ears of corn, the biggest, healthiest, most well-formed kernels from the strongest plants in the field. This wasn't food. This was capital, and the return on it was almost unbelievable by modern financial standards. A single kernel of corn, planted the following spring, could produce an ear with hundreds of kernels, each one capable of repeating the process. In financial terms, that's a return measured in the hundreds of percent every single year, compounding automatically with no fees, no broker, and no risk of a market crash wiping it out overnight. The only requirement was knowledge, the ability to select which years were worth keeping, season after season, gradually improving the strain with every cycle. A farmer who chose poorly one year paid for it the next, in a smaller harvest from weaker seed. A farmer who chose well-built, year over year, a strain of corn perfectly adapted to his specific soil and climate, an asset that couldn't be bought at any price because it didn't exist anywhere else. This was the original compounding investment account, and the interest was paid in bushels, not dollars, directly into the family's own storage, with no middleman ever touching it. 9. Paying the doctor in hogs. On the frontier, the people families depended on most, the doctor, the preacher, and the lawyer, often went weeks without seeing a single dollar, and it didn't matter, because cash was never really the point. A doctor who rode out at midnight to deliver a baby or set a broken leg might be paid in a side of bacon, a sack of cornmeal, a length of homespun cloth, or a promise to help with the harvest when the time came. A traveling preacher, riding a circuit between tiny churches, was often paid almost entirely in meals and a bed for the night, with maybe a few coins added if the congregation had any to spare. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't an insult. It was simply how value moved in a place where everyone had skills and goods, but almost nobody had cash on a given Tuesday. A professional built a kind of floating account across dozens of families, owed a little here, owing a little there, all of it tracked informally and settled in whatever form made sense when the time came. The entire system depended on memory, honesty, and the certainty that everyone involved would be living in the same small community for years, possibly decades, which made cheating someone today a very poor investment in tomorrow. 8. A trade, not a loan. 8. Apprenticeship instead of debt. Before a young person on the frontier could earn a real living, they needed a skill, and acquiring that skill cost something. But it almost never cost money, and it never, ever involved a loan. A boy who wanted to become a blacksmith, a cooper, a wheelwright, or a printer was bound as an apprentice to a master craftsman, often for several years, trading his labor for food, lodging, and training. By the end of the term, he walked away with a trade that could support a family for the rest of his life, and he owed nothing to anyone. No interest had accrued. No payment plan stretched into his 30s. The cost had already been paid, in full, through years of swept floors, hauled materials, and slowly improving skill. Compare that to where young Americans stand today, with student loan debt in this country now well above $1 trillion, often taken on for an education that may or may not lead directly to a paying skill. The apprenticeship system wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always kind, but it solved the exact problem modern education debt claims to solve, turning a young person into a skilled, employable adult, without creating a financial obligation that could follow them for 20 years before they'd even started a family of their own. 7. The Threshing Ring. By the late 1800s, a threshing machine could process grain faster than any single family could ever use it, and almost no individual farm could justify owning one. So neighboring farms did something that modern businesses would call resource sharing, but frontier families just called the way things worked. A group of farms formed a ring, pooled the cost of a threshing machine and crew, and then moved from farm to farm during harvest season, working each property in turn until every field in the ring was cleared. No cash changed hands between neighbors for this labor. Instead, every family kept a mental ledger of who had worked whose fields, for how long, and with how many hands. A farm that had received 8 days of help in September was expected to provide roughly the same the following year, and everyone simply knew this, the way everyone knows the unwritten rules of any close community. The system worked because the ring was small enough that reputation mattered immensely. A family that took help every year but never showed up to return it would quickly find itself at the bottom of the schedule, harvested last, when the weather was worst and the risk of losing the crop was highest. The threshing ring was, in effect, an interest-free credit union built entirely out of labor, trust, and the certainty that next September would come for everyone. 6. Building a hope chest. For a young woman on the frontier, marriage didn't begin with a joint bank account because in many places, married women legally couldn't hold property in their own name at all for most of the 1800s. What she could bring into a marriage was something else entirely, a collection of goods built over years, often starting in early childhood, stored in a wooden chest that traveled with her to her new home. Quilts, linens, towels, and clothing, each one made by hand, represented real, sellable value, the kind of value that could be traded, used as collateral in a pinch, or simply provide a starting household without either family spending a single dollar. A young woman might enter marriage with a dozen finished quilts, each representing weeks of skilled labor, plus woven linens, preserved goods, and sometimes livestock given specifically to her by her own family, set aside from anything her husband controlled. In a legal system that often treated a married woman's assets as her husband's the moment she fed her bells, the hope chest was one of the few forms of wealth a woman could point to and say, "This is mine. I made it, and it came with me." It was, in a very real sense, the only retirement account many women of that era were ever allowed to build for themselves. 5. The lodge that paid you. 5. Fraternal lodge insurance. Long before insurance companies sold policies door to door, millions of Americans were already insured through organizations most people today only associate with secret handshakes and old buildings downtown. Groups like the Odd Fellows, the Masons, and dozens of similar fraternal societies operated something close to a modern insurance system decades before commercial insurance reached most of the country. Members paid small, regular dues into a shared fund. In return, if a member fell sick, the lodge paid a weekly benefit to support his family while he couldn't work. If he died, the lodge covered burial costs and often provided ongoing support to his widow and children. At its peak in the early 1900s, membership in these mutual aid societies numbered in the tens of millions, covering a significant share of American working men, at a time when commercial life insurance was either unavailable or far too expensive for most families. The system worked because it was local, member-run, and built on the same trust that ran the general store ledger. Everyone in the lodge knew everyone else, which made fraud difficult and mutual support feel less like charity and more like an obligation owed in both directions. As commercial insurance companies grew through the 20th century, these fraternal benefit systems gradually faded, but for generations, they were the actual safety net for ordinary American families, built and run by the families themselves. 4. The root cellar vault. Picture the single largest expense in almost any modern household budget. For most families, it's food. Now imagine an entire room dug into a hillside that eliminated a huge portion of that expense for 6 to 8 months at a time, required no electricity, charged no fees, and could never be devalued by inflation, because a potato is a potato regardless of what's happening to the dollar. A full root cellar, packed with potatoes, carrots, apples, cabbages, and jars of preserved food, represented months of groceries, stored and ready, completely outside the cash economy. In financial terms, this was an asset that didn't just hold its value, it held its exact usefulness, unaffected by currency swings, bank failures, or market crashes happening anywhere else in the country. A family with a full cellar in November had effectively prepaid for their winter food budget, locked in at the labor cost of growing and storing it themselves, with zero risk of price increases between then and spring. Compare that to a modern household, which carries essentially zero food inventory and pays current market prices for every single meal, all year, with no buffer against price spikes at all. The root cellar wasn't just food storage. It was a hedge against inflation that most families today have never even considered, built with a shovel instead of a financial advisor. 3. Growing your own insurance. Modern households manage risk by paying for insurance policies, an ongoing cash expense designed to protect against disasters that may never happen. Tier families manage the exact same risks, but they did it by building redundancy directly into daily life. A garden that produced more than a dozen different crops meant that if one crop failed, from drought, pests, or an early frost, the family didn't go hungry. They simply ate more of everything else. A flock of chickens, a milk cow, a smokehouse full of meat, and a root cellar full of preserved food together created overlapping layers of protection against almost any single disaster. If the wheat crop failed, there was still corn. If the corn failed, there was still the garden, the chickens, and last year's stores. No single point of failure could take everything down at once. This is the core principle behind nearly every modern insurance product, spreading risk so that one bad event doesn't become a total loss. But frontier families achieved it without paying a premium to anyone. The premium was diversity itself, the deliberate decision to never depend entirely on any one source of food, fuel, or income. It cost more labor up front, but it cost nothing in monthly payments, and unlike an insurance company, it never denied a claim. 2. The favor ledger. Frontier communities ran on an economy that never appeared in any account book, but that everyone could recite from memory without hesitation. Help a neighbor raise a roof, and you didn't expect payment. You expected that when your own roof needed raising, the same neighbor would show up at dawn with his own tools, no questions asked. Watch another family's children during planting season, and you built a kind of credit that could be called in years later, when your own children needed watching, or when illness struck your house during harvest. None of this was written down, and none of it needed to be. Everyone in a small frontier community carried a running mental tally of who owed what to whom, not in dollars, but in labor, time, and willingness. A family that consistently took help without ever giving it back didn't get sued or sent a collections notice. They simply found, over time, that help arrived a little slower and a little less often, until eventually it stopped arriving at all. This was a credit system with real consequences, enforced not by courts or interest rates, but by the simple, permanent memory of an entire community. It moved enormous amounts of real value, labor worth thousands of dollars by any modern measure, with zero currency, zero paperwork, and an enforcement mechanism that never needed a single liar. 1. Your word was your credit. This is the idea that held every single other entry on this list together, and it's the one the modern financial system was specifically built to replace. On the frontier, when someone needed credit, whether for a loan at the store, a private note from a neighbor, or help with the harvest, there was no form to fill out, no score to check, and no algorithm deciding their fate. There was only one question that mattered. Did people trust this person? Had they paid what they owed before? Did they work hard, keep their word, and show up when they said they would? That reputation was built over years, in full view of an entire community, and it followed a person everywhere they went within that community's reach. It couldn't be bought, it couldn't be faked for long, and it couldn't be erased by moving to a new town, because word traveled with you. In 1989, the modern credit score was introduced, reducing this entire complex, human, community-based system down to a single three-digit number, calculated by a company most people have never spoken to, based on data most people have never seen, about a version of themselves built entirely from payment history. The frontier system wasn't perfect. It could be unfair, slow to change, and brutal to anyone who made one bad mistake in a small town. But it was theirs. It belonged to the community that built it, and no outside institution could quietly adjust the formula while nobody was looking. Banks didn't erase this system because it failed. They erased it because as long as people trusted each other directly, they didn't need to trust a bank at all. Here's the challenge. Pick just one. Start a price book like the ones frontier wives kept, tracking what things actually cost so you can see where your own money goes. Plant a row of something this spring, and let it be the beginning of your own seed bank, kept and improved year after year, owned by nobody but you. Or simply have an honest conversation with a neighbor about trading skills instead of cash, the way a doctor once traded a house call for a side of bacon. None of this is about going back to the 1800s. Nobody is asking you to bury coins in your backyard or pay your dentist in livestock. But every single trick on this list shares one thing in common. It moved real value between real people, without a single outside institution standing in the middle, taking a cut, charging a fee, or deciding whether the transaction was allowed to happen at all. Your ancestors didn't have fewer financial tools than you. They had more, and almost none of them required anyone's permission. Tell me in the comments which one of these surprised you the most, and tell me if anyone in your own family ever mentioned a story like these: a buried jar, an old store ledger, a debt that was settled in something other than cash. That knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because somebody else figured out how to charge you for not having it anymore.